What happens when you walk into the wrong room and catch the city's most ruthless mafia boss in his most vulnerable moment, only for him to decide that he'd rather burn his empire down than let you walk out the door? This isn't a fairy tale. It's a collision of shadows and silk. When a dedicated maid accidentally breaches the sanctuary of a man who commands fear, she expects a swift end. Instead, she finds a man who has forgotten how to be human, in a dangerous, possessive obsession that threatens to shatter them both. If you crave intense, slow-burn tension, the clash between lethal pride and quiet dignity, and a love story forged in the fires of a syndicate war, you've finally arrived at the only room that matters. Before the story begins, take a second to like and subscribe. You won't want to miss what comes next. The transition happened with the cold, surgical precision of a bank transfer. One moment, Nora Jameson was a name on a shift roster, a woman whose worth was measured in the number of pillows she fluffed and the speed with which she cleared room service trays. The next, she was an asset, privately owned and restricted to a single floor. The hotel manager hadn't even looked her in the eye when he handed her the new key card. His hands had been shaking. "Mr. Lee has requested a dedicated concierge for the duration of his stay," he had whispered, refusing to acknowledge the bruised silence of the hallway. "Your contract has been restructured. You report only to him now." Nora stood in the center of the penthouse foyer, her fingers digging into the hem of her white apron. The air up here was different. It didn't carry the faint scent of industrial lemon cleaner or the frantic energy of the lower floors. It was heavy with sandalwood and the silent, vibrating tension of a man who didn't just inhabit a space, but dominated it. "You're late," a voice rasped from the shadows of the living area. Kim Lee was seated on a low-slung velvet sofa, the city lights of the skyline bleeding through the floor-to-ceiling glass behind him. He was still wearing the black silk robe, the belt tied loosely. The geometric tattoos on his neck seemed to shift in the dim light, a complex web of ink that disappeared beneath the collar of his robe, hinting at a map of a much darker life. "I had to pack my things from the staff lockers, sir," Nora said, her voice remarkably steady despite the frantic drumming in her chest. She refused to let him see her tremble. She had spent her life being invisible. She wouldn't start being small now. Kim stood, his movements fluid and predatory. He didn't approach her like a guest. He moved like a man inspecting a new acquisition. He stopped just inches away, close enough for Nora to feel the heat radiating from him. Up close, he was even more striking, all sharp angles and cold, dark eyes that seemed to peel back her layers of professional armor. "The staff lockers are no longer your concern," he said, his voice a low, melodic threat. "Your belongings have been moved to the service quarters in this suite. You eat when I eat. You wake when I wake. And you do not leave this floor without my express permission." Nora's breath hitched. "This wasn't in my job description, Mr. Lee. I am a room service attendant, not a prisoner." A slow, dangerous smile tugged at the corner of Kim's mouth, a ghost of an expression that didn't reach his eyes. "You entered the wrong room, Nora Jameson. In my world, there are no accidents, only opportunities." He reached out, his hand hovering near her face. For a second, she thought he might touch her, but he merely tucked a stray lock of her hair back into her sleek ponytail. His fingers were ice cold. "You have a habit of looking me in the eye. Most people find that difficult. I find it expensive." He turned away, dismissing her with a casual wave of his hand. "Go. Familiarize yourself with the suite. There is a list of requirements on the Marble Island. I expect my tea at 4 a.m. "Exactly." Nora watched him walk toward the master bedroom, the silk of his robe trailing behind him like a shadow. She looked down at the gold keycard in her hand. It felt heavy, like a lead weight. She was in a cage now, a sprawling, multi-million-dollar cage of glass and steel, perched high above the world she knew. She walked to the kitchen, her footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rugs. On the counter sat a leather-bound folder. Inside wasn't just a list of tea preferences or dry cleaning instructions. It was her own personnel file. Her home address, her mother's medical bills, her bank statements. Everything she had tried to keep private was laid bare under the glow of the recessed lighting. At the bottom of the last page, a single line was written in elegant, sharp cursive, property of the chairman. The reality of the golden cage settled over her like a shroud. Kim Lee hadn't just bought her contract. He had mapped out her life. He knew her pressure points, her debts, and her fears. He had turned her into a ghost in his own private haunting. As the clock ticked toward the early hours of the morning, Nora stood by the window, looking out at the city she no longer had the right to walk through. She could see the tiny headlights of cars far below, people going home to lives that were still their own. She felt a surge of that same, startled vulnerability she had felt when she first walked into his room, but beneath it, a spark of her characteristic pride began to flicker. He thought he had bought her. He thought the tattoos and the power made him a god in this high-rise sanctuary. But as Nora set the kettle for his 4 a.m. tea, her jaw tightened. Kim Lee might own the building, the contract, and the air she breathed, but he didn't own the fire she was keeping hidden behind her quiet, "Yes, sir." The fatal mistake had unlocked the door, but Nora Jameson was determined to be the one who decided when it finally closed. The tea service was a silent ritual performed in the blue-gray light of 4 a.m. Nora moved with practiced grace, the porcelain clinking softly as she set the tray on the low mahogany table. Kim Lee was already there, standing on the balcony with the glass door slid open, letting the biting chill of the soul dawn bleed into the climate-controlled perfection of the penthouse. He didn't turn when she entered. He was shirtless, his silk robe discarded on a nearby armchair, leaving his back exposed to the dying stars. It was the first time Nora saw the full extent of the ink. It wasn't just a neck tattoo. It was a sprawling, living tapestry of geometric precision and dark symbolism that cascaded down his spine and wrapped around his ribs like a secondary set of muscles. "It's a ledger," Kim said, his voice cutting through the hum of the city below. He still hadn't looked at her. Every line, every intersection of the pattern. It represents a life changed, a debt settled, or a territory won. Nora paused, the silver tea strainer poised over the cup. She couldn't look away. The tattoos weren't traditional. They were sharp, modern, and clinical, fractals that looked like broken glass. "It looks like a cage," she whispered, the words slipping out before her professional filter could catch them. Kim turned then, his dark eyes tracking her reaction. He didn't look offended. He looked intrigued. He walked toward her, the cold air from the balcony clinging to his skin. As he stepped into the light of the kitchen, Nora saw the scars that the ink couldn't quite hide. Pale, jagged lines that interrupted the perfect geometry. One particularly deep mark cut straight through a series of interlocking triangles on his shoulder. "This one," he said, tapping the scarred ink with a long, elegant finger, "was from my 18th birthday. My father's way of reminding me that in our family, blood is the only ink that doesn't fade. We don't inherit a name, Nora. We survive it." Nora felt a sudden, sharp pang of empathy that she tried to stifle. She was a room service attendant. She was his property. She wasn't supposed to feel the weight of his history. "You talk about it as if you had no choice," she said, finally pouring the tea. The steam rose between them, a fragile veil. "Choice is a luxury for people who live below the 20th floor," Kim replied, taking the cup from her. His hand brushed hers, and the contact was electric, a jolt of warmth against the morning chill. "For me, there was only the veil. The tradition of staying hidden while holding the strings. My grandfather built the syndicate on silence. My father built it on fear. I am the one who has to keep the structure from collapsing." He took a slow sip of the tea, his eyes never leaving hers. "The tattoos are the history of the Kim lineage. To most, they are a warning. To me, they are the weight of every man I've had to break to keep this empire standing. Do they frighten you, Nora?" Nora straightened her apron, her gaze unwavering. She looked at the intricate patterns on his chest, the way they seemed to pulse with his heartbeat. "The ink doesn't frighten me, Mr. Lee. It's the man who chose to finish the drawing that I'm watching." A flicker of something, admiration, perhaps, or a rare moment of recognition, crossed Kim's face. He set the cup down and stepped closer, invading her personal space until the scent of sandalwood and expensive tobacco was all she could breathe. He reached out, tracing the line of her jaw with the back of his hand. It wasn't a caress, it was a claim. "You seek the man behind the veil," he murmured, his thumb brushing the corner of her lip. "That is a dangerous curiosity. Most people who look too closely at the ink find themselves trapped in the pattern." "I'm already trapped in your golden cage, sir," Nora reminded him, her voice barely a whisper. "Does it matter if I look at the bars?" Kim's grip tightened slightly, his eyes darkening. For a moment, the predatory boss vanished, replaced by someone raw and hauntingly lonely. The silence in the penthouse stretched, taut and vibrating with an unspoken tension that made Nora's skin prickle. She could see the pulse in his neck, right where the tattoos began, and she realized with a start that his heart was racing as fast as hers. He let go abruptly, the mask of the cold chairman snapping back into place. He picked up his robe and pulled it on, hiding the violent history of his skin once more. "The meeting starts at 6. I'll need the black suit prepped and the silver cufflinks." "And Nora?" She paused at the kitchen door. "Yes, Mr. Lee. Keep your eyes on the work," he said, his back to her. "The man you're looking for doesn't exist. There is only the chairman." Nora nodded, though he couldn't see her. She walked back to her quarters, her mind reeling from the sight of the geometric ink and the scars beneath it. He wanted her to believe he was nothing more than a cold machine of power, a living ledger of debts and violence. But she had seen the way his hand shook almost imperceptibly when he touched her. She had seen the man behind the veil, and as the sun finally broke over the horizon, painting the room in shades of gold and fire, Nora realized that the wrong room hadn't just unlocked a forbidden love, it had revealed a soul that was just as much a prisoner as she was. The ink was a history of pain, but the look in his eyes was a plea for a future. And that was the most dangerous secret of all. "Tell me something," Kim whispered, leaning his head back against the cushions. "Something that has nothing to do with this hotel. Nothing to do with money." Nora told him about the porch in her childhood home, the way the cicadas sounded in the heat of a Georgia summer, and the smell of her mother's jasmine perfume. She spoke in a low, rhythmic cadence, her voice acting as an anchor in the storm of his mind. She watched as the lines of tension in his forehead slowly smoothed out. His breathing deepened, matching the steady beat of the rain. Slowly, almost tentatively, Kim's head drifted toward her shoulder. Nora froze, her heart hammering against her ribs, but she didn't pull away. When his weight finally settled against her, he let out a long, shuddering sigh. The sound of a man finally dropping a shield he had carried for far too long. He was asleep within minutes. Nora sat perfectly still, the warmth of him seeping through her uniform. She looked down at the man who could end a life with a phone call, now resting peacefully against her, as if she were the only safe harbor in the world. She reached out, her fingers hovering just an inch above the geometric ink on his neck, before she pulled back. For the rest of the night, the most dangerous man in Seoul slept without dreaming of war. And Nora Jameson, the woman who was supposed to be his property, realized that she was the only person in the world who held his true power in her hands. The midnight service wasn't about tea or duty. It was the moment she realized that the cage was no longer just hers. They were locked in it together. The transformation began with a box of black silk and a silence that felt heavier than usual. It wasn't a request. It was a garment laid out on the bed like a shroud. The dress was obsidian, a floor-length slip of liquid moonlight that cost more than Nora's family home, paired with a diamond choker that felt like a cold collar against her throat. "A concierge doesn't attend galas, Mr. Lee," Nora said, her voice echoing in the marble dressing room as she stepped out. Kim Lee was standing by the mahogany bar, adjusting his silver cufflinks. He was dressed in a suit so sharp it looked like it could draw blood, the black fabric high enough to partially mask the geometric ink on his neck. He turned, and for a fraction of a second, the predatory chairman faltered. His gaze swept over her, from the sleek, high ponytail she refused to change to the way the black silk clung to her curves. "Tonight, you are not a concierge," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "You are the only person I trust to stand behind me. In my world, a guest is a shield, and a shield is a statement." The gala was held in a subterranean ballroom beneath one of Seoul's most historic estates, a place where the scent of lilies was thick enough to mask the smell of gunpowder. As they stepped out of the black sedan, the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't just a party, it was a gathering of sharks. Men in tailored wool and women draped in emeralds moved with a stiff, calculated elegance, their eyes darting toward Kim the moment he entered the room. Nora felt the weight of 100 stares. She was the only black woman in the room, a striking contrast in her dark silk, and the way Kim kept his hand firmly on the small of her back sent a ripple of whispered tension through the crowd. "Don't look at their faces," Kim murmured into her ear, his breath warm against the chill of her skin. "Look at their hands. In this room, a handshake is a contract, and a closed fist is a declaration of war." As they moved through the crowd, the shadow of the syndicate became a physical thing. Nora watched as powerful men bowed their heads slightly to Kim, their smiles not reaching their eyes. She saw the way people cleared a path for him, not out of respect, but out of a visceral, bone-deep survival instinct. They were cornered near the balcony by an older man with silver hair and a scar that mirrored the one on Kim's shoulder. "Chairman Kim," the man rasped, his eyes sliding over Nora with a look of clinical disgust. "I didn't realize you were bringing outsiders into the inner circle. Is this the new standard for the veil?" Nora felt Kim's fingers tighten against her waist. The temperature around them seemed to drop 10 degrees. "The standard is whatever I decide it is, Park," Kim replied, his voice a low, lethal hum. "And Nora isn't an outsider. She's the only person in this room who isn't trying to calculate the price of my head." The older man laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "Careful, boy. Affection is a luxury the syndicate doesn't permit. A weak spot is just a target with a heartbeat." The rest of the night was a blur of high-stakes tension. Nora stood by Kim's side as he negotiated territories and settled blood debts with nothing more than a nod or a cold stare. She saw the true nature of his golden cage. It wasn't just the penthouse. It was this entire world of whispered threats and hidden blades. She watched a waiter drop a glass nearby, and the way 3 of Kim's men instinctively reached for their waistbands made her blood run cold. This wasn't a romance. It was a minefield. When they finally retreated to the balcony for a moment of air, the silence of the night felt like a mercy. Nora looked out at the dark gardens, her hand trembling as she gripped the stone railing. "You see it now, don't you?" Kim asked, standing behind her but not touching her. "The shadows don't just stay in the room, Nora. They follow the bloodline. They're all waiting for you to fail," she whispered, turning to look at him. The moonlight hit his face, highlighting the exhaustion he had tried to hide behind the chairman's mask. "They don't see a man. They see a throne they want to sit on. And now they see you," Kim said, his eyes dark with a sudden, fierce regret. He reached out, his gloved hand cupping her cheek. "I brought you here to show them I couldn't be touched. But all I did was show them where to strike." The realization hit Nora like a physical blow. By bringing her here, by claiming her as his guest, Kim hadn't just given her a dress and diamonds. He had painted a target on her back. She wasn't just a maid anymore. She was a piece on his chessboard. "I'm not afraid of them," Nora said, her pride flaring even as her heart raced. "I was a ghost in this city long before I met you, Kim Lee. They can't break what they can't even see." Kim looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, the predatory hunger in his eyes was replaced by a profound, terrifying respect. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. "You are the most dangerous thing in this room, Nora Jameson, because you're the only thing that makes me want to stay alive." As the music from the ballroom drifted out, a haunting, minor-key melody, Nora realized that the forbidden love they were dancing around wasn't just a social taboo. It was a death sentence. The gala had pulled back the veil, revealing that in the world of the syndicate, the only thing more dangerous than being Kim Lee's enemy was being the woman he loved. The day after the gala, the penthouse felt less like a sanctuary and more like a command center under siege. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and expensive espresso, vibrating with the constant, low-frequency hum of encrypted phone calls. Nora moved through the suite with her usual quiet efficiency, but the black silk dress from the night before seemed to have left an invisible weight on her shoulders. She was no longer just the help. She was the woman the syndicate was whispering about. The breach happened during a late afternoon briefing. Kim was sequestered in the dining room with 3 of his top lieutenants and a man Nora hadn't seen before, a tall, oily associate named Han who carried himself with the unearned arrogance of a man who mistook cruelty for competence. Nora entered the room to refresh the water carafes, her gaze fixed strictly on the task. She could feel Han's eyes crawling over her, a physical sensation that made her skin prickle with revulsion. "So, this is the concierge everyone is talking about," Han said, his voice a nasal drawl that cut through the technical discussion of shipping routes. He didn't look at Kim. He kept his eyes locked on Nora's waist as she reached for a glass. "I must say, Chairman, your taste in imports is quite exotic. Though I imagine a woman of her background is more suited for the lower floors than the penthouse." The room went deathly silent. One of the lieutenants stopped mid-sentence, his pen hovering over a map. Nora froze, her hand tightening around the glass pitcher. She had heard variations of this her whole life, the subtle and not-so-subtle reminders that she was perceived as out of place. But hearing it here, in the inner sanctum of a man she had started to trust, felt like a cold blade to the ribs. She didn't look up, her professional mask firmly in place. "Would you like ice with that, sir?" she asked, her voice a flat, controlled melody. Han let out a sharp, mocking bark of a laugh. "I'd like a little more than ice. Tell me, girl, does the chairman pay you by the hour, or are you just part of the furniture now? I've been looking for someone to look after my private quarters in Busan, and you certainly have the aesthetic I'm looking for." Before Nora could breathe, the sound of a heavy chair scraping against the marble floor echoed like a gunshot. Kim Lee didn't stand. He surged. In a blur of black wool and lethal intent, he was across the room. His hand shot out, grabbing Han by the throat and slamming him back against the mahogany sideboard. The crystal decanters rattled, a frantic, glass-on-glass chatter that mirrored Nora's heartbeat. "Chairman," Han gasped, his face turning a mottled purple as Kim's grip tightened. "You are in my home," Kim whispered, his voice so low it was almost a growl. The cold mask hadn't just slipped, it had shattered, revealing a raw, terrifying protective fury. The geometric tattoos on his neck seemed to darken, the ink pulsing with the rush of his blood. "You are breathing my air, standing on my floor, and you have the audacity to speak to her as if she were a commodity?" "It was a joke," Han wheezed, his hands clawing uselessly at Kim's iron forearm. "Nora Jameson is the only person in this building whose name you are not worthy to speak," Kim said, his eyes burning with a dark, predatory fire that made the other lieutenants look away. "She is not furniture. She is not an import. And if you ever look at her with that filth in your eyes again, I will ensure you never see anything ever again. Do I make myself clear, Han?" With a final, disgusted shove, Kim released him. Han collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, his arrogance replaced by a primal, shaking terror. Kim didn't spare him another glance. He turned to the other men, his chest heaving slightly. "Get him out of here. The Busan contract is terminated. If I see him on hotel property again, consider it a declaration of war." The lieutenants scrambled to haul Han out of the room, the heavy double doors thudding shut behind them. Silence reclaimed the suite, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Heavy, intimate, and fractured. Nora stood by the table, her hands still trembling as she held the pitcher. She looked at Kim, expecting the chairman to return, expecting him to apologize for the outburst or dismiss her back to the kitchen. Instead, he stayed where he was, his head bowed, his shoulders tense. "Nora," he said, his voice cracking slightly. He looked up, and for the first time, she saw fear in his eyes. Not fear of an enemy, but fear of his own lack of control. "I'm sorry you had to hear that. I'm sorry I brought that filth into your space." He walked toward her, his movements slow and tentative, as if he were approaching a wounded animal. He stopped just inches away, but he didn't touch her. He looked at her hands, still white-knuckled around the glass. "You didn't have to do that," Nora whispered, her pride struggling against the overwhelming surge of emotion in her chest. "I've handled men like him before. Not while I'm breathing," Kim said, his voice fierce and final. He reached out, his fingers brushing against hers, gently prizing the picture from her grip and setting it on the table. Then, he did something he hadn't done since she arrived. He took both of her hands in his large, tattooed palms completely enveloping hers. "You aren't a ghost anymore, Nora. I see you. And I will make sure the rest of the world sees you with the respect you've earned, or I will burn the world down." In that moment of shared vulnerability, the first breach was complete. The wall between the boss and the maid hadn't just been crossed, it had been demolished. Nora looked up into the eyes of the man who had just risked a lucrative contract and a political alliance for her dignity, and she realized that the forbidden love was no longer just a possibility. It was an inevitable, beautiful, and terrifying reality. She didn't pull her hands away. For the first time since she walked into room 1808, Nora felt like she wasn't just a guest in his world, she was the heart of it. And as Kim leaned his forehead against hers, the silence of the penthouse finally felt like peace. The shift in the penthouse atmosphere was instantaneous, moving from the fragile peace of the previous night back into a pressurized, static-charged silence. It began with a name on a visitor's log at the front desk, Marcus Vance. To the rest of the world, he was a childhood friend from Georgia, a face from a life Nora had almost forgotten. To Kim Lee, watching the security feed in his private office, he was a variable he couldn't control. Nora had asked for 1 hour. She stood in the lobby lounge, the sunlight streaming through the high windows, illuminating the genuine, easy smile she wore as Marcus pulled her into a brief, familiar hug. He was everything the penthouse was not: loud, warm, and smelling of cedar and travel. "You look good, Nora. Different, but good," Marcus said, his voice a comforting drawl that made her chest ache with nostalgia. He reached out, playfully tugging on the end of her sleek ponytail. "Last time I saw you, you were dreaming of flight school. Now you're running the top floor of the fanciest building in Seoul." Nora laughed, a bright, clear sound that she hadn't realized was missing from her repertoire. "It's been a long road, Marcus. A lot of wrong rooms." High above, in the reinforced glass sanctuary of the 18th floor, Kim Lee stood at the edge of the mezzanine, his knuckles white as he gripped the railing. He wasn't looking at the city. He was looking at the way Nora leaned toward the stranger. He watched the way her shoulders dropped, the way she didn't check the time, and the way she touched Marcus's arm when he told a joke. The jealous king didn't rage, he froze. The ink on his neck felt like it was tightening, a physical manifestation of the possessive instinct that had been simmering beneath his suits for weeks. Every shadow in the room seemed to deepen as his mind calculated the distance between them and the ease of the man who knew a version of Nora he could never touch. When Nora returned to the suite 45 minutes later, the air was cold enough to frost the windows. Kim was sitting at the mahogany island, a glass of amber liquid untouched in front of him. He didn't look up when the door clicked shut. "Your guest has departed?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "He's just passing through on a layover," Nora said, sensing the tension immediately. She moved to the kitchen to begin the afternoon prep, her professional mask sliding back into place. "We grew up on the same street. He's like a brother." "He touched you," Kim said. He stood up, his movements slow and deliberate, the silk of his robe whispering against the floor. He collapsed against her, his weight nearly taking them both to the floor. The scent of sandalwood was gone, replaced by the metallic, copper tang of fresh trauma and the bitter smell of gunpowder. They moved faster than the shadow," he wheezed, his eyes unfocused as he looked up at her. His hand, slick with red, left a visceral streak across the white of her apron. "The veil, it broke, Nora." She managed to guide him to the sofa, her mind racing. This was the moment the hotel manager had warned her about. This was the reality of the syndicate. Kim Lee wasn't just a man in a penthouse. He was a target in a war that never ended. As she pulled back the torn silk of his robe, she saw the wound, a jagged tear across his side where a bullet had grazed him, slicing through the geometric tattoos he wore like armor. For a heartbeat, Nora froze. The door to the suite was still unlocked. His security team was nowhere to be seen, likely intercepted or left behind to handle the aftermath. She looked at the gold keycard sitting on the marble counter. She could run. She could take the service elevator, disappear into the soul night, and never look back at the golden cage, or the man who had turned her life into a high-stakes drama. The exit was right there, as clear as the moonlight hitting the glass. Kim looked at her, his dark eyes clouded with pain, but suddenly, heartbreakingly clear. He saw her look toward the door. He didn't reach out to stop her. He didn't command her to stay. He simply let out a shuddering breath and leaned his head back, surrendering to the darkness. "Go," he whispered, a ghost of a command. "While they are distracted. Go home, Nora." The word home hit her harder than the sight of the blood. Home wasn't a street in Georgia anymore. It wasn't a staff locker or a shared apartment. Nora didn't move toward the door. Instead, she turned and sprinted toward the medical kit she knew was kept in the master suite. She returned with antiseptic, bandages, and a needle, her movements fluid and desperate. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice a fierce, low melody as she knelt beside him. The next hour was a blur of focused agony. Nora had to peel the blood-soaked silk away from his skin, her fingers trembling as she cleaned the wound. Kim groaned, his fingers digging into the velvet of the sofa, his knuckles turning white. Each time he flinched, the geometric ink on his chest seemed to ripple, a map of a history that was currently trying to kill him. "Why?" he rasped as she began to stitch the tear in his side, her hands surprisingly steady for someone who had never seen a gunshot wound before. "You have the key. You have the head start. Because you didn't sleep for 3 years until I arrived," Nora whispered, looking up at him, her eyes bright with a mixture of terror and an undeniable, forbidden love. "And because a monster would have dragged me down with him. You told me to run." She finished the last stitch and applied the bandage, her hands covered in his blood, the ink of his life. As the adrenaline began to fade, the silence of the penthouse returned, but it was no longer heavy with tension. It was heavy with a profound, terrifying intimacy. Kim reached out, his hand weak but his grip sure, and pulled her toward him. He didn't care about the blood on her uniform or the tears starting to track through the dust on her face. He pulled her head down to his chest, right over his racing heart. "You chose the cage," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "You chose the man behind the ink." "I chose you," Nora corrected, closing her eyes and listening to the steady, rhythmic beat beneath his scarred skin. As the sun began to rise over the skyline, painting the blood-stained silk in shades of gold and amber, Nora realized that the wrong room had led her to a place from which there was no return. She hadn't just healed his body. She had claimed a part of his soul that the syndicate could never touch. The bloodied robe was a testament to the war outside, but as Kim's hand stroked her hair in the quiet dawn, Nora knew that the real battle was just beginning. She had stayed, and in the world of the syndicate, staying was the most dangerous move of all. The copper scent of the previous night's violence still clung to the vents of the penthouse, a grim reminder that the glass walls offered no real protection from the world below. Kim sat at the head of the long obsidian dining table, his frame rigid despite the heavy bandages beneath his fresh charcoal suit. Across from him sat 3 men, the Council of the Veil, their faces as weathered and unyielding as the traditions they upheld. Nora stood in the shadows of the kitchen, her hands clasped tightly. She was invisible again, a ghost in a service uniform, but the way the council members kept glancing toward the hallway told her that her presence was the only thing on the agenda. "The attempt on your life was not a lapse in security, Chairman," the eldest member, Elder Park, said, his voice a dry rasp that seemed to suck the warmth out of the room. "It was a message. You have grown soft. Your focus is fractured by a domestic interest." Kim's expression didn't flicker. He leaned back, the silver cufflinks Nora had polished that morning catching the harsh overhead light. "My focus has never been sharper, Elder. The attackers have been dealt with. The leak has been plugged." "The leak is not the problem," Park countered, his eyes sliding toward the kitchen where Nora stood. "The distraction is. A woman with no lineage, no stake in our history, and far too much access to your pulse. The syndicate does not permit a heart, Kim Lee. It only permits a fist. The silence that followed was a physical weight. Nora felt her breath hitch. She saw Kim's hand tighten on the arm of his chair, the knuckles turning white. "She is my personal concierge," Kim said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "Her contract is private. Her presence is a matter of my personal comfort. Personal comfort is a luxury for those who don't wear the ink," the second member added, tapping the table. "The syndicate has survived for generations because we remove the things that make us blink. You didn't blink when we took your father's rivals. You didn't blink when we expanded into Busan. But last night, you bled because you were looking back at this door instead of the man with the knife." Elder Park stood up, the motion slow and deliberate. He leaned over the table, his shadow falling across Kim's face. "The ultimatum is simple, Chairman. Dispose of the girl. Return her to the shadows she came from, or we will find someone who can lead without a blind spot. You have 24 hours to prove that the chairman is more than the man in the silk robe." Kim didn't stand. He didn't shout. He simply looked up at the men who had shaped his life into a series of geometric constraints. "And if I refuse?" Park's smile was a thin, bloodless line. "Then the council will conclude that the Kim lineage has reached its end, and we will treat the distraction as we treat any other threat to the veil." The men filed out of the suite, their footsteps echoing like a funeral march. As the heavy doors clicked shut, the silence of the penthouse felt suffocating. Nora stepped out from the kitchen, her gaze meeting Kim's. The ultimatum was out in the open now, a jagged blade held to both of their throats. "You heard them," she whispered, her voice trembling but her gaze steady. "They'll kill you for me, or they'll kill me to get to you." Kim surged to his feet, ignoring the sharp flare of pain from his stitched side. He was across the room in 3 strides, his hands framing her face with a desperation that shattered the last of his professional veneer. "They think they can dictate the terms of my life," he hissed, his eyes burning with a dark, rebellious fire. "They think the ink is a leash. Kim, you can't fight the council. Not for a maid. Not for a girl from Georgia," Nora said, a single tear escaping and tracking through the dust of her resolve. "Return me to the lower floors. Let me go back to being invisible. It's the only way you stay alive. I was dead for 3 years before you walked into the wrong room." Kim roared, the sound echoing off the glass walls. He pulled her closer, his forehead resting against hers, his breathing ragged. "I have spent my life building a cage of gold and shadows, and I finally found the only thing in it that matters. I will not give you back to the dark." "What are you going to do?" she asked, her heart hammering against his chest. Kim pulled back, his jaw setting into a line of lethal determination. He walked to his desk and pulled out a heavy, black lacquer box, the one that held the seals of his authority. "They want a standoff? I'll give them one. They think the syndicate is a tradition. I'll show them it's an empire, and I am the one who holds the keys." He looked at her, the jealous king and the wounded boss, merging into something new. A man who was ready to burn his own throne just to keep the woman standing in front of him. "Pack your things, Nora. Not for the lower floors. For the vault. The vault. The only place they can't reach," he said, his fingers tracing the geometric tattoos on his neck one last time before buttoning his collar. "Tonight, the veil ends. We're going to war with the men who made me. And when the sun rises, you won't be a distraction anymore. You'll be the reason the syndicate fell, and the reason I finally woke up." The high-stakes standoff had begun. The gold keycard that had once been her cage was now her only shield. As Kim reached for his phone to call his loyalists, Nora realized that the forbidden love was no longer just a secret whispered in the dark. It was the spark that was about to set the entire city on fire. The transition did not happen with a roar of gunfire, but with a silence so absolute it felt like the world had stopped breathing. The council's deadline had passed, and the penthouse was no longer a cage. It was a fortress. Kim Lee stood by the vast glass windows, no longer dressed in the sharp charcoal suit of a chairman, but in a simple black sweater that hid the bandages and the ink alike. The lacquer box containing the seals of the syndicate sat open on the marble island, its contents looking like nothing more than cold, heavy trinkets in the morning light. Nora stood behind him, her suitcase packed not with the hotel's diamonds, but with the few things she had brought from Georgia. She watched his reflection in the glass, the man who had ruled a city through fear, now looking at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. "It's done," Kim said, his voice a low, steady melody that lacked its usual lethal edge. "I've signed the transition. The council has their stability, and Park has the title he's coveted for 30 years. The veil is no longer my burden to carry." Nora stepped forward, her hand reaching out to touch his shoulder. "You gave it all up. The power, the hotels, the lineage, for a woman you found in the wrong room." Kim turned, and the transformation was complete. The jealous king and the cold boss had vanished, replaced by a man whose eyes were finally clear of the shadows. He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that made her breath hitch. "I didn't give up power, Nora. I traded a throne of glass for a life that actually has a pulse. I spent 28 years being a legacy. I want to spend the rest of my life being a person." He picked up the gold keycard from the counter, the one that had once dictated her movements, and walked to the service elevator. Instead of swiping it, he snapped the plastic in two, the sharp crack echoing through the empty suite. He dropped the pieces onto the floor, a discarded relic of a life lived in a golden cage. "They think I've been defeated," Kim whispered, pulling her into the heat of his chest. "They think taking the syndicate away is a punishment. They don't realize that the only mistake I ever made was thinking I needed their permission to be free." Nora leaned her head against his heart, hearing the steady, calm rhythm she had first discovered during that midnight service. The city below was still moving, still loud and chaotic, but up here, the air finally felt light. "Where do we go now? The council won't just let you walk away. The council only cares about the chairman," Kim said, a small, genuine smile tugging at his lips, the first one Nora had seen that reached his eyes. "The chairman is dead, but the man who loves you has a very good head start and a lot of accounts they don't know about. We're going to a place where nobody cares about geometric ink or who owns the building." They walked out of the penthouse together, leaving the silk robes and the bloodied history behind. As the elevator descended, Nora looked at Kim, really looked at him, and saw that the tattoos on his neck no longer looked like a cage. They looked like a map of the road that had led him to her. When the doors opened at the ground floor, they didn't head for the black sedans or the waiting security teams. They walked through the lobby, past the startled staff and the guests who had no idea they were witnessing the end of an empire. They stepped out into the crisp Seoul air, the sun finally breaking through the clouds to paint the street in shades of amber. Nora took his hand, her fingers interlocking with his, her grip sure and defiant. The fatal mistake had led her to a dangerous world, but it had also unlocked a love that was worth every risk, every tear, and every shadow. "You're late, Mr. Lee," she teased softly, repeating the words he had said to her on her first day in the cage. Kim squeezed her hand, his eyes bright with a future he was finally allowed to want. "I'm exactly where I need to be, Nora." The wrong room had led them to the right life. As they disappeared into the crowd, two ghosts finally becoming real, the syndicate became a memory, and their love became the only truth that mattered. The cage was empty, the seals were broken, and for the first time in his life, Kim Lee was finally, beautifully, home. If this story made you feel something, please like the video and subscribe to this channel for more.